An angry stranger storms into a cafe, pointing fingers at Melania Trump for wearing a red MAGA hat. What happens next? A conversation so unexpected leaves everyone questioning their own assumptions and redefining kindness. It was a calm and sunny afternoon in the heart of the city, and the cozy cafe buzzed with quiet energy. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, mingling with the soft hum of conversations and the occasional clink of cups. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting warm golden streaks across the rustic wooden tables and polished floor. In one corner of the cafe, Melania Trump sat by herself, her figure exuding grace and elegance despite her casual attire. She wore a simple white blouse paired with dark jeans, but what stood out most was the bold red MAGA hat perched neatly on her head. It was an unmistakable symbol, one that carried layers of meaning for many who glanced her way. Melania sipped her coffee slowly, her slender fingers curling around the porcelain cup as she gazed out the window. Her expression was calm, almost serene, as though she was relishing this rare moment of solitude. The public eye, with its relentless scrutiny, had been a constant in her life for years, but here in this small cafe, she hoped to blend into the background. However, her hope for anonymity was fleeting. As much as she tried to stay unnoticed, her striking presence and the bold red hat caught the attention of a few patrons. Whispers began to ripple through the cafe, accompanied by subtle glances in her direction. Some eyes held curiosity, others a touch of judgment, but no one dared approach her yet. The air in the cafe seemed to shift slightly, charged with a quiet tension. Melania, though aware of the stares, remained composed, her focus seemingly on the coffee in front of her. She was no stranger to attention, but even she didn't anticipate how this ordinary moment would soon turn into something extraordinary. The peaceful hum of the cafe was suddenly shattered as the door flew open with a loud bang. A man stormed in, his face flushed and his movements abrupt, drawing startled glances from the patrons. He looked to be in his late 40s, his clothes well worn but tidy, and his eyes carried the sharp intensity of someone with something to say and no intention of holding back. He scanned the room, his gaze darting from table to table until it landed on Melania Trump, sitting calmly in the corner. His eyes locked on the bold red MAGA hat atop her head, and his jaw tightened. "You've got to be kidding me!" he barked, loud enough to make everyone in the cafe freeze mid-conversation. Heads turned, forks paused halfway to mouths, and the soft clink of cups stopped abruptly. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath. Melania looked up, her calm demeanor contrasting starkly with the man's fury. She said nothing, her face composed, as the stranger took a few steps closer, pointing an accusatory finger at her. "That hat?" he snapped, his voice trembling with anger. "Do you have any idea what that represents to people like me? You think you can just sit here, sipping your fancy coffee, pretending to understand the real world?" His words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The barista behind the counter hesitated, her hand hovering near the phone, clearly torn between calling for help and staying out of it. The tension in the room was palpable. Some patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Others watched with rapt attention, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. "You think you're one of us," the man continued, his voice rising. "You have no idea what it's like to struggle, to fight for every scrap, while people like you walk around with your privilege, acting like you care." Melania remained silent, her gaze steady but kind. She didn't interrupt or try to defend herself, letting the man's words echo through the cafe. Her composure only seemed to inflame him further. "Do you even know what it's like to lose everything?" he demanded, his voice breaking slightly. "To have nothing? No, you don't. People like you. Sir, Melania said softly, cutting through the tirade with surprising gentleness. Her voice was steady, but her tone carried a calm authority. Perhaps you should sit down. The unexpected response caught the man off guard. He faltered, blinking at her as if trying to process what she had just said. The cafe, still tense, seemed to hold its breath once more. The man's shoulders rose and fell with heavy breaths, his anger still evident but momentarily checked by her composed demeanor. He hesitated, his gaze flickering to the empty chair across from her. Around the room, patrons waited, their eyes darting between the two. Please, she said again, gesturing to the seat. Sit. Let us talk. The room felt suspended in time, the tension shifting into something more uncertain. Slowly, the man pulled out the chair, his movements reluctant but deliberate. What followed would leave the entire cafe questioning their assumptions. Melania Trump's calm demeanor remained unshaken as the stranger's anger filled the cafe like a storm cloud. While the man's words were sharp and confrontational, she sat quietly, her hands resting lightly around her coffee cup. Her red MAGA hat, the source of his outrage, sat firmly on her head, but her expression remained composed, almost serene. Sir, she said gently, her voice cutting through the tension like a soft breeze. You seem upset. Why don't you sit down, and we can talk? Her unexpected invitation hung in the air, silencing even the faintest whispers in the cafe. The man blinked, momentarily thrown off by her calm response. His clenched fists loosened just a little as he looked around, his gaze darting from the curious patrons to Melania's steady eyes. You want me to sit? He scoffed, his tone still sharp but now tinged with disbelief. What could you possibly say that I want to hear? Melania nodded slightly, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Sometimes, talking helps, she said. If nothing else, it might help me understand what's bothering you. The man hesitated, his breathing still heavy, his posture still tense. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out again, but something about her unwavering composure made him pause. The room felt suspended in time as every patron watched the exchange, their eyes flickering between Melania and the man. Finally, he grabbed the back of the chair and dragged it across the floor with a harsh screech, dropping into the seat with an audible sigh. He crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw tight as he stared at her. Fine, he muttered. But don't expect me to go easy on you. Melania didn't flinch. Instead, she offered a small, disarming smile. I wouldn't dream of it, she replied, her voice steady. The man leaned forward, his tone still sharp but less aggressive than before. You sit here, wearing that hat, acting like you're one of us, he said, gesturing toward the MAGA hat. Do you even know what it stands for, what it means to people like me? Melania listened attentively, her head slightly tilted as if giving his words the weight they deserved. I understand that it means different things to different people, she said calmly. But I'd like to know what it means to you. Her response caught him off guard again. He opened his mouth as if to retort, but no words came. Instead, he leaned back, exhaling sharply. You want to know? He asked, his voice quieter now. It means broken promises. It means people like me working hard every day and still falling behind. It means being forgotten while the rich get richer. He paused, his eyes scanning her face for a reaction. To his surprise, there was no defensiveness or dismissiveness, only a quiet understanding. I'm sorry you feel that way, Melania said softly. But I'm listening. Please, go on. The man hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. He began to speak, haltingly at first, then with more conviction. He shared how he had lost his job when the factory he worked at shut down, leaving him and hundreds of others scrambling for answers. He spoke about struggling to make ends meet, losing his home, and feeling abandoned by the very people who had promised to fight for him. Melania's eyes remained fixed on him, her expression empathetic. She nodded occasionally, offering small affirmations that encouraged him to continue. "I'm angry," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "Angry at the world, angry at people who seem to have it all and don't even notice the rest of us." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the espresso machine. Patrons who had initially been curious now seemed deeply moved, some looking away to process the raw emotion in the man's voice. When he finally stopped, Melania took a moment before responding. "I can see why you feel that way," she said gently. "Life hasn't been fair to you, and I won't pretend to fully understand what you've been through. But I do know what it's like to feel judged before people even know who you are." The man looked up sharply, his anger replaced by a flicker of curiosity. "What do you mean?" he asked. Melania leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "People look at me and see only the surface: a name, a role, a symbol. They make assumptions about my life, my beliefs, and my intentions. But they don't know me. They don't see the woman behind the headlines." The man's posture relaxed ever so slightly. The tension that had filled the cafe began to dissipate as her words settled over him. "You listen to me," he said after a long pause. "No one ever does that." Melania smiled faintly. "Sometimes, that's all it takes," she said. "A little listening, a little understanding. It doesn't fix everything, but it's a start." The man sat stiffly in the chair across from Melania, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as if shielding himself from the vulnerability he knew was coming. His jaw clenched, and he glanced around the room at the silent patrons who pretended not to be listening but whose eyes betrayed their curiosity. Taking a deep breath, he finally spoke. "You want to know why I'm so angry?" he began, his voice trembling with a mix of bitterness and sorrow. "It's because life hasn't given me a fair shot. It's because I've been pushed down so many times, I don't know how to stand anymore." Melania didn't interrupt, her expression steady and inviting, as if urging him to continue. The man looked down at the table, tracing the wood grain with his finger as he spoke. "I had a good job once, you know. Nothing fancy, just honest work at a factory. I worked hard every day, made sure my kids had food on the table, and that my wife didn't have to worry about the bills." He paused, his voice cracking slightly. "But then one day, it was all gone. They shut the factory down, moved it overseas, they said. Cheaper labor, higher profits." His lips twisted into a bitter smile. "What about us, the hundreds of us who were left behind with no jobs, no answers? We were just forgotten." Melania's gaze softened, and she nodded slightly, acknowledging his pain without interrupting. "I tried," he continued, his voice heavier now. "I tried to make it work. Took whatever odd jobs I could find. Construction, landscaping, you name it. But it was never enough. The bills piled up, the stress got worse, and my family." He stopped, swallowing hard. For a moment, it seemed like he couldn't continue, but after a deep breath, he pushed forward. "My wife left. Took the kids with her. Said she couldn't live like this anymore, couldn't watch me fail over and over again. And you know what, I can't even blame her." The cafe was utterly silent. Even the hum of the espresso machine seemed to fade as the man's raw emotions filled the room. Patrons who had been curious were now visibly moved, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others staring into their coffee cups as if trying to process his words. "I lost everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My family, my home, my sense of worth. And now I walk into places like this, and I see people like you," he said, looking directly at Melania, his eyes glistening. "People who look like they've never had a bad day in their lives. It makes me so damn angry because no matter how hard I try, I'll never have what you have." Melania held his gaze, her expression one of deep empathy. She didn't flinch or look away, and her silence seemed to give him the space he needed to keep going. "And you know the worst part," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "It's not just the money or the job. It's the way people look at me now. Like I'm invisible. Like I'm nothing. Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and see people judge you without knowing a damn thing about you?" His words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. A woman at a nearby table shifted in her seat, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. Another patron stared intently at his phone, but it was clear he wasn't reading anything. "I didn't come in here to pick a fight," the man admitted after a long pause. I saw you, sitting there with that hat, and I thought, here's someone who's had it easy. And I couldn't keep it in anymore. I'm tired of being angry all the time, but I don't know how to stop." The raw honesty in his voice seemed to pierce through the air, reaching not just Melania but everyone in the room. It was as if his words had stripped away the surface-level differences between them, exposing something universal: pain, loss, and the deep human need to be seen and understood. Melania leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped on the table. "Thank you for sharing that with me," she said softly. "I can see how much you've been through, and I'm sorry for your pain. I don't know what it's like to walk in your shoes, but I'm here to listen." Her words seemed to reach him in a way he hadn't expected. The tension in his shoulders eased just a little, and his gaze softened. Around the room, the atmosphere shifted. What had started as a confrontation now felt like a moment of connection, a rare glimpse into the shared struggles that often go unnoticed. For the first time, the man looked less like an antagonist and more like someone searching for understanding. "I don't know why I told you all that," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "But thank you for listening." Melania nodded, her expression kind. "Sometimes, that's all any of us need," she said. "Someone to listen." Melania sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, as the man's story poured out. She didn't interrupt or fidget, her full attention fixed on him. Her calm and steady gaze softened the raw edges of his anger, allowing his words to flow freely. Around them, the cafe remained hushed, patrons captivated by the unfolding conversation. When he finally paused, his shoulders sagged with exhaustion from reliving his pain, Melania took a moment before speaking. Her voice was gentle, yet carried a sense of sincerity that drew everyone closer, even if they pretended not to be listening. "Thank you for sharing that with me," she began, her tone warm and without a hint of condescension. "It takes courage to open up, especially about something so personal." The man glanced at her, his expression wary but softened by her acknowledgement. He didn't respond, so she continued. "I know I can't fully understand what you've been through," she said, her words deliberate. "But I do know what it feels like to be judged before people even know who you are. It happens to me all the time." Her statement seemed to catch him off guard. "You?" he asked skeptically, his brow furrowing. What could people possibly judge you for? Melania offered a faint, almost wistful smile. Because of what they think they know about me, she said. Because of my name, my role, and yes, this hat. She gestured to the red MAGA hat resting on her head. For some, it's a symbol of hope and pride. For others, it's something entirely different. They don't see me as a person, they see an idea, a headline, a symbol of something they've already decided to hate or admire. Her words hung in the air, resonating not just with the man but with everyone in the room. The barista paused mid-step, a tray of cups balanced in her hands, and several patrons exchanged quiet glances. I didn't choose the assumptions people make about me, Melania continued, her voice steady. But I've learned that I can choose how I respond to them. I can let their judgments define me, or I can try to connect with them and show them the real me. The man's hardened expression began to crack. He leaned back in his chair, his arms loosening from their defensive cross. And what do you think they'd see if they got to know the real you? He asked, his tone softer now, almost curious. They'd see someone who understands what it's like to feel invisible, Melania said. They'd see someone who had to prove herself time and again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. Because I believe that no matter where we come from or what we've been through, we all deserve to be seen and heard. Her humility was disarming, and the man seemed to wrestle with her words, as if they didn't quite fit the image he had built of her in his mind. I never thought about it that way, he admitted, his voice quieter now. Melania offered a small, understanding smile. It's easy to make assumptions, she said. We all do it, even when we don't mean to. But the only way to truly understand someone is to listen. The man nodded slowly, the tension in his body easing further. Around him, the café's atmosphere felt lighter, the initial tension replaced with a quiet sense of connection. You listened to me, the man said after a long pause, his voice tinged with gratitude. I didn't expect that. Melania leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting his. Sometimes, that's all it takes, she said. A little listening, a little understanding. It doesn't fix everything, but it's a start. The man's lips twitched into a faint smile, the first sign of warmth he had shown all afternoon. And in that moment, the cafe felt less like a room of strangers and more like a gathering of people who had all been reminded of something important, the power of empathy and the strength it takes to truly see one another. The man sat back in his chair, his shoulders no longer hunched with tension. The anger that had fueled his tirade earlier seemed to dissolve, replaced by a mix of exhaustion and contemplation. He looked at Melania, his eyes scanning her face as if trying to reconcile the person he had assumed she was with the person sitting calmly before him. You're not what I expected, he said finally, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Melania offered a faint, understanding smile. I'm glad you feel that way, she said. It means we've had a real conversation. The man exhaled deeply, his hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. Look, he began, his voice shaky, I'm sorry. I came in here mad at the world and took it out on you. I saw the hat, and I just assumed you were another person who couldn't understand people like me. He paused, his eyes dropping to the table. But you listened. You didn't judge me, even when I was yelling at you. That's more than most people would have done. Melania leaned forward slightly, her expression soft and empathetic. Thank you for saying that, she said. And I understand where your anger comes from. Life hasn't been fair to you, and I don't blame you for feeling the way you do. Her words seemed to strike a chord. The man nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the table. "I've been carrying this anger for so long," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "At first, it felt like it was the only thing keeping me going. But now it just feels heavy." Melania reached out, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. "Anger can be a powerful thing," she said. "It can push us to fight for what's right, but if we're not careful, it can also blind us to the good that's still around us." The man looked up at her, his eyes glistening. "You're right," he said. "I've let it take over. I've judged people without really knowing them. And I did that to you today. I'm sorry for that." Melania's smile was gentle but genuine. "We all make assumptions," she said. "It's part of being human. What matters is that you're willing to see things differently now. That takes courage." The man rubbed the back of his neck, his posture finally relaxing. "You're a lot kinder than I thought you'd be," he said with a faint chuckle. "I guess I owe everyone here an apology, not just you." Around them, the cafe patrons who had been silently watching the exchange nodded and smiled, some even murmuring words of encouragement. The atmosphere, once tense and uncomfortable, had shifted into something lighter, more hopeful. Melania leaned back slightly, giving the man space to gather his thoughts. "It's never too late to change," she said softly. "And it's never too late to start seeing the good in people." The man nodded again, this time with more confidence. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady now. "Not just for listening, but for helping me see things differently. I didn't expect that today." Melania's smile widened, her eyes warm. "Sometimes, it's the unexpected conversations that teach us the most," she said. As the man stood to leave, he glanced around the cafe, his expression softer than when he had entered. "I hope I didn't ruin anyone's day," he said to the room, his voice tinged with humility. A few patrons chuckled, one even clapping lightly, and the barista gave him a small nod of approval. The man looked back at Melania one last time. "Thank you," he said simply, before walking out the door. The cafe, now filled with a sense of calm and connection, buzzed quietly once more. And in that moment, it was clear that something important had shifted, not just for the man, but for everyone who had witnessed it. As the man left the cafe, his shoulders no longer weighed down by anger, the patrons exchanged glances. The tension that had gripped the room earlier had dissolved, replaced by a quiet sense of reflection. Conversations resumed, but they were softer now, more thoughtful. People who had initially been observers were now participants in something greater, an unexpected moment of connection and empathy. One woman, seated near the window, set down her phone and smiled at the man sitting across from her. "That was something, wasn't it?" she said, breaking the silence between them. The man, who had been silently sipping his coffee, nodded. "Makes you think about how quick we are to judge," he replied. At another table, a young couple who had been whispering nervously during the confrontation now held hands across their table, their expressions warm. The barista, who had been frozen in indecision earlier, moved with renewed energy, offering patrons refills with an extra touch of friendliness. Meanwhile, near the counter, a passerby who had wandered into the cafe during the exchange had captured a portion of the scene on their phone. The video showed Melania's calm demeanor, the man's eventual apology, and the quiet applause that followed. With a quick caption, "Empathy in action. Sometimes listening is all it takes." The passerby uploaded it to social media. Within hours, the video began to gain attraction. Comments flooded in, with people praising Melania's kindness and composure. This is what the world needs, more of: understanding and humility. She could be reacted with anger, but instead, she chose grace. We can all learn from this. A powerful reminder that everyone has a story worth listening to. The ripple effect wasn't limited to the cafe. Inspired by the exchange, people online began sharing their own stories of kindness and understanding. Strangers paid for each other's coffee, neighbors reached out to one another, and small acts of empathy seemed to multiply. Back in the cafe, the atmosphere was brighter. Patrons were no longer strangers but individuals who had shared an extraordinary moment. Smiles were exchanged, and even quiet nods of acknowledgement carried a deeper meaning. What had begun as an angry confrontation had transformed into a powerful lesson, a reminder that kindness and understanding can break down walls, soften hearts, and inspire others to do the same. As Melania stood to leave, she glanced around the cafe one last time. The once tense atmosphere had transformed into something warm and uplifting. Quiet conversations had sprung up between strangers who moments ago had avoided eye contact. Smiles were exchanged across tables, and even the barista, who had hesitated to intervene earlier, worked with a noticeable spring in her step. Melania walked to the door, her red MAGA hat catching the sunlight streaming through the windows. She opened the door gently, stepping into the crisp afternoon air, and disappeared down the street. She left no grand farewell, no lingering presence, but those who remained in the cafe knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The man who had confronted her sat quietly at his table, his hands resting on the worn wood. His earlier rage had been replaced by a thoughtful stillness. He replayed their conversation in his mind, the way she had listened without judgment, responded with empathy, and left him questioning the assumptions he'd carried for so long. For the first time in years, he felt something shift. His anger, which had been a constant companion, felt lighter, less suffocating. He realized that his outburst hadn't changed the world, but her willingness to listen had changed his perspective. She didn't have to listen to me, he murmured to himself, his voice soft. But she did. And that made all the difference. Around him, the cafe buzzed with a renewed energy. Strangers smiled at one another, quietly inspired by the kindness and understanding they had witnessed. It was a small moment, but one that carried a profound lesson. Sometimes, all it takes is listening to understand that we're not so different after all.